The film made it look simple. A smiling mob boss, a public rally, a sudden burst of gunfire, chaos, then silence. A moment reduced to spectacle. But the truth was far darker. On June 28, 1971, in the heart of Columbus Circle, New York City, a man who had spent years stepping out of the shadows was gunned down in broad daylight. Not in secret, not in a back room, but on a stage, surrounded by thousands. His name was Joe Colombo, and unlike the quiet, invisible figures who traditionally controlled organized crime, Colombo wanted to be seen. That was his first mistake. Joseph Anthony Colombo Sr. was not supposed to become one of the most recognizable faces in American organized crime. He was not born into power, nor did he inherit a dynasty. Born in 1923 in Brooklyn, Colombo grew up in a working-class Italian-American neighborhood where survival required adaptability. His father had been involved in bootlegging during Prohibition, a common entry point into organized crime for many immigrant families. But Colombo himself did not immediately follow that path. In fact, by outward appearances, he lived a relatively ordinary life. He worked as a longshoreman. He later opened a small business selling real estate and insurance. He dressed neatly, spoke carefully, and projected the image of a respectable citizen. But beneath that surface, he was quietly building connections. According to multiple documented accounts, Colombo's rise within the mafia was not fueled by violence or reputation, but by something far more valuable: trust. He became associated with the Prophesy crime family, one of the 5 families of New York. At the time, the organization was led by Joe Prophesy, a boss known for his strict control and heavy demands on his soldiers. Colombo was not the loudest man in the room. He was not feared in the traditional sense, but he understood power structures. He understood loyalty, and more importantly, he understood when to wait. That patience would define his ascent. The 1950s and early 1960s were a period of instability within the mafia. Internal conflicts, betrayals, and power struggles were becoming more frequent. The old rules were beginning to crack. One of the most significant fractures came from within Colombo's own family. Joe Gallo, a rebellious and unpredictable figure within the Prophesy organization, led a violent internal war against the leadership. The conflict, known as the First Colombo War, left multiple men dead and exposed the fragility of mafia unity. Colombo remained on the sidelines. He did not align himself openly with either faction. He observed, he waited, and when the dust settled, he moved. After the death of Joe Prophesy in 1962, leadership passed briefly to Joseph Magliocco. But Magliocco's rule was short-lived. His involvement in a failed plot against other mafia leaders led to his downfall. By 1964, the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, needed someone stable, someone controlled, someone predictable. They chose Joe Colombo. At just 41 years old, Colombo became the boss of what would soon be renamed the Colombo crime family. It was an unusual choice. He was young for a boss. He lacked the traditional aura of intimidation, but he had something others did not. He was disciplined, and he was careful, at least at first. The mafia had always thrived in secrecy. Its power depended on silence, on invisibility, on the ability to operate without drawing attention. The most successful bosses were those who avoided publicity at all costs. Colombo rejected that philosophy. In 1970, he did something unprecedented. He stepped into the public eye. Following a series of FBI arrests targeting Italian-American men under the suspicion of organized crime involvement, Colombo seized an opportunity. He framed the investigations not as law enforcement, but as discrimination. He founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League. It was a bold move. The League organized rallies, protests, and public events, claiming to defend the rights of Italian Americans against what Colombo described as systemic bias. The message resonated. Thousands attended the events. Politicians took notice. Celebrities expressed support. And for the first time, a sitting mafia boss was not hiding. He was speaking, publicly. The film never showed this transformation. Joe Colombo was no longer just a crime boss. He was becoming a public figure, a spokesperson, a symbol. But behind the scenes, nothing had changed. According to investigators, Colombo continued to oversee illegal operations, including loan sharking, labor racketeering, and extortion. The difference was that he now operated under a spotlight. and that spotlight made people uncomfortable, especially within the mafia. The old guard saw Colombo's actions as reckless, dangerous, a violation of everything the organization stood for. The commission had long enforced strict rules against attracting attention. Public exposure invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited investigations. And investigations led to arrests. Colombo was breaking those rules, and he showed no intention of stopping. By early 1971, the Italian-American Civil Rights League had grown into a powerful movement. Its largest event was scheduled for June, a rally at Columbus Circle. Thousands were expected to attend. It would be Colombo's biggest stage yet, a demonstration of influence, a display of power, but also, according to some accounts, an opportunity. Because not everyone saw the rally as a celebration. Some saw it as a moment of vulnerability. There were tensions building beneath the surface. Joe Gallo had recently been released from prison. His relationship with Colombo and the leadership of the family remained hostile. The war that had once divided the organization had never truly ended. It had only paused. Now, with Colombo in the spotlight, some believed the balance of power could shift again. Investigators later discovered that multiple factions within organized crime had concerns about Colombo's growing visibility. Some feared he would bring unwanted attention. Others believed he had become too powerful. And then there were those who saw an opportunity for revenge. The rally preparations continued. Permits were secured. Security was arranged. Speakers were scheduled. Colombo would take the stage in front of thousands, surrounded by supporters, family members, and associates. It was meant to be a moment of triumph, but there were warning signs, subtle, easily ignored. According to later accounts, some members of Colombo's inner circle had concerns about security. The open nature of the event made it difficult to control access. Anyone could approach the stage, but Colombo dismissed the risks. He believed the crowd was his protection. He believed his public image made him untouchable. He believed no one would dare. June 28th, 1971. The day began like any other summer afternoon in New York City. The air was heavy. The streets were crowded. By midday, thousands had gathered at Columbus Circle. Banners were raised. Speeches began. The atmosphere was almost celebratory. Colombo arrived surrounded by associates. He greeted supporters, shook hands, smiled. He moved through the crowd, not like a man in danger, but like a man in control. Witnesses later described him as calm, confident, unaware. Behind the stage, security was minimal. There were no metal detectors, no controlled checkpoints, just a handful of men watching the perimeter. Among the crowd, faces blended together. Supporters, curious onlookers, and at least one man who did not belong. He had been seen earlier, moving quietly through the area. He did not draw attention. He did not appear nervous. He was waiting. Colombo stepped onto the stage. The crowd responded immediately. Applause, cheers, cameras flashed. For a moment, everything unfolded exactly as planned. He approached the microphone. He began to speak. And then, a figure moved forward. Close enough. Too close. What happened next will be captured in fragments. Witness statements, police reports, grainy photographs. A moment that lasted only seconds, but would alter the course of organized crime in America. Because as Colombo stood at the center of his own creation, his movement, his audience, his stage, the illusion of control was about to shatter. And the man who believed visibility made him powerful was about to learn the cost of being seen. The shooter raised his weapon. The shooter raised his weapon. For a fraction of a second, the crowd did not react. There was no immediate understanding, no recognition of what was about to happen. Just a man stepping forward, arm lifting, the metallic outline of a handgun catching the afternoon light. Then the first shot rang out. It cut through the noise of the rally with unnatural clarity. A single, sharp crack that silenced everything around it. Joe Colombo was struck in the head. His body collapsed almost instantly, folding backward as the microphone stand toppled beside him. The cheers turned into screams. The stage, once a symbol of power, became a scene of chaos. But the violence did not end there. According to multiple documented accounts, Colombo's bodyguards reacted within seconds. They rushed toward the gunman, weapons drawn, firing repeatedly. The shooter was hit multiple times. He fell to the ground before he could escape. Within moments, Both men lay motionless. One of the most powerful mafia bosses in America, and the man who had just shot him. The film never showed how quickly everything spiraled out of control. Panic spread through Columbus Circle. Thousands of people began to move at once, pushing, shouting, trying to escape. Some ducked behind barriers. Others dropped to the ground. The sound of sirens began to rise in the distance. On the stage, Colombo's associates surrounded him. Blood pooled beneath his head. He was still alive, but barely. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Colombo was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, his condition critical. The gunman, later identified as Jerome Johnson, was pronounced dead at the scene. But even in those first moments, something did not make sense. Because Johnson was not a known figure in organized crime. He was not Italian. He had no clear ties to the mafia. And yet, he had just walked directly up to a mafia boss, in front of thousands, and pulled the trigger. Investigators immediately began piecing together what had happened. Witnesses described Johnson as calm, focused, not acting alone, but not visibly accompanied either. He had approached the stage without resistance. He had not attempted to flee. And most importantly, he had been killed before he could speak. That detail would become critical, because without a surviving shooter, there would be no confession, no immediate explanation, only speculation. And in the world of organized crime, speculation often concealed something far more deliberate. According to police reports, Johnson had arrived at the rally earlier that day. He blended in the crowd, moving closer to the stage as the event progressed. There were no security checks. No one questioned his presence. He waited until Colombo began speaking. Then he acted. The simplicity of the execution raised immediate questions. This was not a chaotic or impulsive attack. It was precise, direct, timed for maximum visibility. A public assassination attempt. But by whom? The official narrative initially suggested that Jerome Johnson was a lone gunman. But investigators quickly found inconsistencies. Johnson had a background that did not align with political activism or personal grievance against Colombo. He had minor criminal records, but nothing that suggested he would carry out an attack of this scale. More importantly, there were reports, unconfirmed but persistent, that Johnson had been seen in the company of individuals connected to organized crime in the days leading up to the shooting. Investigators later discovered that Johnson had checked into a hotel in New York shortly before the rally. He was not from the area. Someone had brought him there. Someone had prepared him. Suspicion began to shift, and one name surfaced almost immediately: Joe Gallo. Joseph "Crazy Joe" Gallo had long been a disruptive force within the mafia. Unpredictable, violent, ambitious. He had once been part of the same family Colombo, now controlled. But their relationship had been defined by conflict. Years earlier, Gallo had led a rebellion against the prophesied leadership, resulting in bloodshed and division. He had spent time in prison, but his influence had not disappeared. And now he was free. According to multiple accounts, Gallo had grown increasingly resentful of Colombo's rise. He saw Colombo not as a legitimate leader, but as someone who had benefited from the power vacuum left behind. There were also reports that Gallo viewed Colombo's public activities, the rallies, the speeches, as reckless. A violation of the mafia's most important rule: stay invisible. But the truth was far more complex. Because if Gallo had ordered the hit, the choice of assassin raised questions. Why use an outsider? Why someone with no clear ties to the organization? Investigators believe the answer was strategic. Using a non-Italian gunman created distance. It reduced the immediate connection to the mafia. And if the shooter was killed, which he was, the trail would end there. No interrogation, no names, no confirmation, only suspicion. In the days following the shooting, law enforcement agencies intensified their investigation. Surveillance increased. Known associates were questioned. Informants were pressured. But concrete answers remained elusive, because those who might have known the truth were not speaking. And in some cases, they were disappearing. Meanwhile, Joe Colombo remained in critical condition. Doctors managed to keep him alive, but the damage was severe. The bullet had struck his head, causing irreversible brain injury. He never regained consciousness. The man who had once commanded an entire crime family was now confined to a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to move, suspended between life and death. But his absence created a new problem: a power vacuum. The Colombo crime family was suddenly without a functioning leader. And in the mafia, leadership is not left unclaimed for long. Almost immediately, internal tensions began to rise. Different factions positioned themselves for control. Allies of Colombo sought to maintain stability. Others saw an opportunity, because without Colombo, the structure he had built began to weaken. At the same time, the attempted assassination had consequences beyond one family. It disrupted the balance of power across all 5 families. The commission could not ignore what had happened. A boss had been shot in public, in front of thousands. This was not just an internal dispute. It was a crisis. According to investigators, meetings were held behind closed doors. Discussions focused on 2 questions. Who was responsible? And what would the response be? Because if Joe Gallo had ordered the hit, retaliation was inevitable. But retaliation required certainty, and certainty was in short supply. Then, new information began to surface. Witnesses came forward claiming that Johnson had been seen with individuals linked to Gallo's crew. Phone records, limited by the technology of the time, suggested possible connections. Nothing definitive, but enough to reinforce suspicion. And in the mafia, suspicion can be as dangerous as proof. As the investigation continued, violence began to escalate. Members of rival factions were targeted. Allies of Gallo were watched closely. The fragile peace that had existed was beginning to collapse. Because the shooting of Joe Colombo was not just an attack. It was a signal. The film never captured what came next. Because what followed was not immediate. It was slower, more calculated. A series of moves that would reshape the underworld. Because while Colombo lay in a hospital bed, unable to respond, others were already deciding his fate. And the fate of the man they believed responsible. Joe Gallo knew he was a target. He had survived conflicts before. He understood how these situations unfolded. And he knew that if the commission decided he was responsible, there would be no negotiation. Only consequences. For months, tension built. Surveillance intensified. Movements became cautious. Meetings became quieter. But the outcome was already forming. Because in organized crime, there are moments when decisions are made long before they are carried out. And by early 1972, those decisions had been made. Joe Colombo would never recover. But his shooting had already set something in motion. Something irreversible. Because the man suspected of ordering the attack was about to face the response of an entire system designed to eliminate threats. And when it came, it would not happen in public. Not on a stage. Not in front of thousands. It would happen the way the mafia preferred. Quietly. Precisely. And without witnesses. On April 7th, 1972, Joe Gallo walked into Umberto's Clam House. On April 7th, 1972, Joe Gallo walked into Umberto's Clam House. It was just after midnight in Little Italy. The restaurant was busy, filled with the low hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and the routine rhythm of a Friday night. Gallo was not hiding. He sat openly at a table with his family, celebrating his birthday. There was no visible security, no immediate sense of danger. But according to multiple documented accounts, the decision to kill him had already been made, and the men assigned to carry it out were already inside. The film never showed the precision of what followed. It was not a chaotic ambush. It was controlled, calculated. Witnesses later described several men entering the restaurant calmly. They did not rush. They did not draw attention. They moved with purpose, positioning themselves before anyone realized what was happening. Then the shooting began. Gunfire erupted at close range. Gallo reacted instantly, overturning the table and attempting to escape. He ran toward the exit, weaving between tables as bullets struck the walls behind him. He made it outside, but not far. On the sidewalk of Mulberry Street, Joe Gallo collapsed. He had been hit multiple times. The men who shot him disappeared into the night. No arrests were made. No one was officially charged. But within organized crime, the message was clear. The retaliation for Joe Colombo had been delivered. Investigators later examined the scene in detail. Shell casings, witness statements, ballistics reports. But like the shooting at Columbus Circle, the evidence led to conclusions without confirmation. There were strong suspicions about who had ordered the hit. Members of the Colombo family, possibly with approval from the commission. But no one spoke. And without cooperation, the case remained unresolved. By the time Gallo was buried, the balance of power had already shifted. The Colombo crime family, though weakened, began to reorganize. Leadership passed quietly to others within the organization. The public visibility that had defined Colombo's reign disappeared almost overnight. The rally stopped. The Italian-American Civil Rights League faded from prominence, and the experiment of a public-facing mafia boss came to an abrupt end. Joe Colombo never regained consciousness. He remained in a vegetative state for years, his body sustained by medical care, his mind permanently gone. According to medical reports, the damage to his brain was catastrophic. He cannot speak. He cannot move. He cannot command. The man who had once stood before thousands was now confined to silence. He died on May 22, 1978, not from another act of violence, but from the lingering effects of the one that had already destroyed him. But the truth was far darker than a simple story of revenge, because the question that had lingered since 1971 was never fully answered. Who really ordered the shooting of Joe Colombo? The most widely accepted theory pointed to Joe Gallo. It fit the narrative. He had motive. He had history. He had the willingness to act. But investigators and historians have long debated whether the reality was more complex. Because Colombo had made enemies beyond Gallo. By stepping into the public eye, Colombo had violated a fundamental principle of organized crime. Secrecy was protection. Visibility was risk. And Colombo had not only become visible, he had become outspoken. He had drawn attention not just from law enforcement, but from the media, politicians, and the general public. That attention created pressure that extended beyond his own family. According to some accounts, members of the commission were deeply concerned about Colombo's actions. His rallies, while framed as civil rights activism, risked exposing the internal structure of the mafia. They risked provoking investigations. They risked bringing unwanted scrutiny to all 5 families. And in that world, one man's recklessness could threaten everyone. Investigators later explored the possibility that Colombo's shooting was not solely an act of personal revenge, but a sanctioned removal. A decision made collectively. A message delivered through indirect means. Because using an outsider like Jerome Johnson created distance. It allowed those responsible to deny involvement. And if the shooter was killed immediately, as he was, the truth would die with him. There were also theories involving external influences. Some suggested that law enforcement agencies had informants within Colombo's circle who may have provided information that led to the attack. Others speculated about connections to radical groups, pointing to Johnson's background. But these theories remain speculative, unproven, and often contradictory. What is known as this? Jerome Johnson never spoke. Joe Colombo never recovered. Joe Gallo was killed less than a year later, and no one was ever convicted for any of it. The film simplified the story. It reduced it to a single act of violence, a moment. But the reality was a chain reaction. One decision leading to another. One violation of the rules triggering consequences that could not be reversed. Colombo believed he could change the nature of power. He believed that visibility could protect him, that public support could shield him, that stepping into the light would make him untouchable. But organized crime does not operate in the light. It survives in silence, in shadows, in systems where exposure is a liability, not an advantage. Investigators later concluded that Colombo's greatest mistake was not his involvement in crime. It was his belief that he could redefine it, that he could maintain control while abandoning the very principles that had sustained the mafia for decades. He underestimated the resistance. He underestimated the consequences. And when the response came, it followed the rules he had chosen to ignore. Not publicly, not with speeches or statements, but through violence. Calculated, untraceable, final. The Italian-American Civil Rights League disappeared. The crowds moved on. The stage at Columbus Circle was dismantled, and the moment that had once symbolized power became a warning. Because in the end, Joe Colombo did achieve something no mafia boss before him had done. He became visible, recognizable, famous. But that visibility came at a cost. One that the film never fully captured. One that cannot be undone. He was not killed instantly. He did not die on that stage. He lived for years after the shooting. But everything that made him powerful ended in those few seconds. The voice, the authority, the control, all gone. And in the world he came from, There are fates worse than death. Silence is one of them. Permanent, unanswered, unexplained. Because the real story of Joe Colombo is not just about who shot him. It is about why. And that answer remains buried, hidden somewhere between loyalty, fear, and the rules no one was supposed to break. A story without witnesses, without closure, and without a final confession.